Welcome to World at Work TV. I'm Allison Avalos, and I'm joined today by Peter Kurlander of Aero Electronics, and we're talking about global sales compensation plans. Peter, why do organizations implement global sales plans?
So typically companies are putting in global sales comp plans to simplify things. That's generally the driving factor. But what simplify means is very different to different companies. In some cases, simplify is code for lower administration costs by having fewer plans and having more similarity across plans across regions. In other cases, simplify is really trying to create a global sales model where you have similar plans in different regions and different parts of the world. That way you can move people seamlessly from one region to another in order to support, for example, a global account or some other large accounts that you might have. In both cases, though, the process to get there, whether you're trying to identify cost savings or you're trying to drive a global sales coverage model, it's basically the same design effort.
So how is designing global plans different from designing domestic plans?
The elements of designing global plans is very similar to domestic plans in that you still care about the same things. You care about eligibility for incentive plans, pay levels for incentive plans, what the performance measures are, crediting, all the similar things that you would normally go through in designing a domestic plan. One of the big differences between designing global and domestic is the number of stakeholders. Domestically, usually there's a head of sales for whatever country you happen to be based in, say North America, for example, and that's your key go-to. Frequently, when you're designing global plans, you've got many, many stakeholders, and it can get very, very political because you have to meet the needs of different stakeholders coming from very different cultures, as well as the fact that you're operating on different time zones, and the business issues in each country may be different. You know, these types of projects can be real easy if you have a common and consistent coverage model where the roles are the same globally, but generally they're not. Most of the time it's much more complicated than that. And so one of the challenges you have to deal with is that political complication of keeping your stakeholders happy and continuing to move the project forward. One of the other things to consider when you're doing a global design is really understanding the costs associated with it. If you're trying to do what we call a top-down global design, which is a small team basically dictating to the different regions what the plans are going to be, well, there's some implications in terms of how you work with stakeholders because they may not have as much of a stake in the process. If you're doing a bottoms-up where you're actually trying to get global involvement, you can get a lot more buy-in in those types of projects, but it can be very expensive because global travel is not cheap, and just like any domestic project, it's not usually a one-day meeting and you're done. Usually it's multiple meetings with multiple stakeholders, and for a global project, you might be meeting different parts of the world. So you have to really make sure that the project is structured correctly from the very beginning, that you've clearly identified what type of project you're running, and that you've got the right stakeholders involved from the very beginning of the project.
In what cases would it be better to implement a global plan as opposed to a regional plan?
In situations where you actually truly have global sales teams, which a lot of companies don't. A lot of companies call people global, but they're really not. But if you actually truly have global sales teams that have buy decisions in different parts of the world, then having a global structure makes a lot of sense because it's easier to move resources around, which is something you want to do. It also makes sure that the performance measures that you're measuring each team on in each region are closely aligned. A lot of times, though, these projects are really about simplifying, and simplifying, as I mentioned earlier, is code words for saving costs. And having a single global plan or single plan design doesn't necessarily save you any costs. It can, but oftentimes it doesn't. What really drives cost savings is more frequently the having common financial systems that you're measuring on, having more automated systems for tracking and calculating your compensation plans, and other factors that are really more back office than just having a single plan design. The cost for creating one plan document versus 5 is minimal actually in the design process.
How can you ensure the success of a global sales plan implementation?
In order to increase the likelihood of success, it's really about understanding what type of project you're trying to run, whether it's a top-down design or a bottoms-up design. In a top-down design where you're really coming in and saying, here's what we're doing, and that's being driven by senior leadership team of your company, it's real important to make sure that whoever the stakeholders are and whoever the drivers of that project are very vocal in what they want to do. You don't want to be the person going to each region and saying, here's what we're doing, particularly if you're not a very senior leader. So you want to have that senior leader, whoever's driving that project, be very vocal. Here's what we're doing. Here's what I'm expecting from you as leaders in your region, and I'm expecting you to adopt these changes. On a bottoms-up project, you get a lot more buy-in, but those projects typically take a lot longer, although they are adopted more readily in the regions. The trick with those, though, is cost. Those are expensive projects. And so you need to be able to have the budget to be able to actually have regional meetings, different parts of the world, and you do typically want to rotate those meetings so it doesn't become a US-centric project. So for those sort of projects, you need to make sure that you've got the budget to actually be able to be successful on those type of projects. And you need to make sure, like the other projects, that you're clear on what your goals are and what you're trying to drive. They can be political as well, particularly if you have different coverage models, because whenever you're dealing with someone's pay, that's a very sensitive topic. And so no matter which direction you go, someone's going to be happy and someone's not. So you have to be very careful when you go in those waters.
So what have you learned along the way? Any best practices to share?
I'd say the things that works the most is experience. The more experience you have on these, just like designing domestic plans, the easier it is. And also being flexible. Many companies are striving to have global designs where it's a single design that crosses all region. In many cases, the coverage models are different, and so you might be able to have 50% of it or 70% of it that's common across regions, but be able to have some flexibility for local customization based on legal requirements or just based on different styles that might be applicable in different parts of the world. And so that flexibility becomes very critical as you work with your global partners in trying to design. One technique that I've seen work fairly well, particularly for companies who are just starting to get into this space, is what we call the design guide technique, where you pull together a group, whether they're senior folks or mid-level managers, and decide globally what standards do we want to have. So we might decide that we want to have a common mix of base incentive across the globe. Or we might want to have all plans to have revenue as a performance measure. And whatever those things are, you pick a small section of them, maybe 2 or 3 things, and year 1, that's what you drive towards. And you may have a year 2 and year 3 plan where over those coming years, there's things that you move to make them more common across the globe, but you don't push it all in at once. And that's a technique that I've seen work fairly well. It also tends to be less threatening. And one of the things that is always out there whenever you do these types of projects is there's always that fear by those local resources that what you're doing will eliminate or impact their job. And that's not what these projects generally are trying to do.
Thanks, Peter. Some great information for anyone considering implementing this type of plan.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
For World at Work TV, I'm Allison Avalos.